Good morning, and thank you for choosing to attend my presentation today. So as you can see, I'm going to be looking at the challenges facing the global pharmaceutical market today and how those challenges can be addressed. I'd like to start with some background information on the pharmaceutical market as a whole. As I'm sure you know, in the majority of cases, the price of goods and services in a particular market normally find their equilibrium through the meeting of supply and demand. In other words, the price of goods or services reflects both the availability and the demand. So if demand rises and a lot of people want something, then if the supply remains at the same level, the price will go up. And if that supply increases, we'd expect the price to come back down, and vice versa. If demand falls, the price goes down until the supply is reduced, and so on. But as we'll see, the pharmaceutical market is different. The pharmaceutical market is not a perfect market where supply perfectly matches demand. And this leads us to the situation we have today. So, I'd just like to outline the situation with regard to expenditure on medical products globally. We'll start with the figures from 1990 and 2000, and then we'll look at the most recently available figures, published in 2011, which come from the World Health Organization, the WHO. And I should say that I'm basing all of my figures on publications by the WHO. The WHO is the world's most visible global health organization with a 193 country membership, which means it operates at both a global and a local level. This global reach means that they are able to collect data from more countries than any other organization. Okay, as we can see, this table shows the private and government per capita expenditure on pharmaceuticals in 1990 and 2000. All the figures are in US dollars. There are several things going on here. First, private expenditure on pharmaceuticals outweighs government expenditure in all income categories, so high, middle and low incomes. Second, the total expenditure increased very substantially in this decade. If we compare the totals of the years 1990 and 2000, we can see that the increase is around 50% overall, with higher increases in the middle income countries. And third, there is a significant variation between countries with different incomes. If we look at the year 2000, the governments of low-income countries spent just over $1 per capita on pharmaceuticals. Contrast this with the expenditure of high-income countries, $167. This is a huge difference, obviously. There are some more recent figures, and these seem to show a similar trend, that per capita pharmaceutical expenditure has been increasing steadily for a number of years. In 2005 to 2006, this ranged from $7.61 US in low-income countries up to $431.6 in high-income countries. Compare this with 1995, when the highest rate of increase was in low and middle-income countries. The WHO figures allow us to make some interesting observations regarding inequalities in expenditure. For example, 16% of the world's population currently live in high-income countries, and they account for over 78% of global expenditure on medicines and medical products. Now, total pharmaceutical expenditure, or TPE, as it's often referred to, TPE is much higher in high-income countries, as you might expect. However, compared with low-income countries, a much smaller proportion of this money is spent on actual medicines or drugs. Since 1995, the private share of TPE has been increasing in low and middle income countries, but not in high income countries, and I'll come back to this public-private distinction a little later. So, having looked at the global market in pharmaceuticals, I want to now look at some of the associated problems. As I said at the beginning, the pharmaceutical market is not a perfect market where supply balances with demand, and I'd like to explore some of the reasons why. In this section of my talk, I'll be basing my material on the work of Wally and Wright, and by the way, I'll give you all the references at the end. Okay, the pharmaceutical market is a bit of a special case for a number of reasons. First of all, in general, consumers are not particularly well informed about the medical products they're using. Consumers tend to be better informed about products like, well, the clothes they buy, food products, white goods and the gadgets they use and so on. Typically, most people don't know much about the quality and the safety of their medicines, and They tend to take these just on trust. And they're not especially well informed about either of the effectiveness of their medication or how appropriate a particular medication can be for their condition. Secondly, there actually isn't much competition in this market. There are a large number of consumers, or potential consumers, in the world. In effect, the entire population of the world is a potential consumer. If you compare that for a moment with manufacturers of other kinds of products, let's say, for example, sat-navs, you're immediately limited to consumers who own a car. Nobody is going to buy a sat-nav if they don't have a car to put it in. But potentially everyone is a consumer of pharmaceutical products. And while there's an enormous number of consumers, there are relatively few suppliers. Basically, there are healthcare providers, purchasers, and manufacturers. Thirdly, there is the issue of monopolies. Manufacturers are known to create monopolies through the use of patents, which protect their medicines from being copied by other manufacturers for a fixed number of years. Manufacturers can also patent their manufacturing processes, which makes it even harder for competitors. Related to this, there's also brand loyalty, just as there is in many other sectors, which is achieved partly at least through intensive marketing. A great deal of money is spent on marketing pharmaceutical products in high-income countries, like the United States. There have also been cases of price fixing by producer cartels in order to keep market prices artificially high. Finally, I just want to mention external factors, externalities, which exist in the sector. This means that treatment for some conditions, especially communicable diseases like tuberculosis and some sexually transmitted infections, benefits not only the patient receiving the treatment, but also the wider public, because their risk of contracting the disease or infection is also reduced. So I hope this analysis shows that the pharmaceutical market is quite unlike most other markets. I would go as far as to say it is a market which has failed. It is a failed market. A key point to emerge from this is that the financing of medicines and the balance between government and private financing plays a critical role in the market. So, I'd like to propose 6 ways of keeping costs down and improving the profile of the pharmaceutical market. Most parties agree that medicine costs need to be kept down, so national governments have a key role to play in drawing up principled lists of cost-effective medicines. Alongside this, the generic market can be promoted so that pharmacists can replace more expensive branded consumer drugs with the equivalent generic ones, which tend to be much cheaper. Therapeutic substitution is also possible. In other words, adapting a particular patient's therapy, moving to a lower cost drug program. Governments can use their buying power to negotiate with the manufacturer on prices. They can do this effectively by comparing the medicines with others on the market. Another option for promoting competition and putting downward pressure on prices is parallel imports. Now, this is where patented medicines are brought from another country where they cost less. This is often because the price has been negotiated down by that country's government. One further option is compulsory licensing. Compulsory licensing is where a local manufacturer is licensed to produce a patented drug under license and usually at a lower price. In fact, the World Trade Organization allows compulsory licensing under certain conditions, normally related to the public interest. So these measures illustrate the choices available to stimulate local pharmaceutical markets, and indeed the global market as well. Any health financing system has to be sustainable in the longer term. It needs to promote equality, efficiency, and the rational use of medicines. I'd like to now consider some of the issues raised in managing medicines. I'd like to look at public financing, health insurance, and user fees. I put these on a handout here for you to take away at the end. As far as public financing is concerned, this finance is mainly raised through taxation. This has a number of advantages. One is that it becomes easier to select supplies of various medicines and target them at the people who need them the most. Another advantage is that the government can control the quality of medicine. They can achieve economies of scale by buying in large quantities. And also, the cost of payment is effectively shifted to a wide base of the population. Not just the sick, but everyone in work who is paying taxes. And since tax is normally collected as a percentage of income, it means that those earning higher salaries pay more. In many countries, health insurance has an important role to play in the management of medical supplies. Health insurance is a mechanism for sharing risk among a section of the population. Health insurance schemes may be public or private, compulsory or voluntary. Basically, all developed countries, with the exception of the United States, have some kind of public health insurance system, which covers part or all of the cost of medicines for most of or all of the population. However, in developing countries, this kind of scheme is much rarer. Health insurance schemes should be an attractive option for these countries too, since medicines account for a large share of total household expenditure in many developing countries. But there are risks too, and these include overprescription, abuse and fraud. If they're going to work effectively, health insurance schemes need to include measures to prevent the costs from spiralling out of control. Okay, finally, user fees. In developing countries, user fees make up over 2/3 of the expenditure on medicines, mainly from the private sector, because people typically buy medicines from private sellers. An alternative is cost recovery schemes. These are where people have to pay back some or all of the cost of medicines after they've been prescribed. These recovered fees are then put back into the general medical expenditure budget. Now, supporters of user fees tend to argue that they improve the general availability of medicines and efficiency in terms of the supply. Also, they help to reduce overconsumption and they allow public funds to be spent on the people who are most in need. But in reality, the needs of the poorest are often not met. So there has to be some kind of system of checks and balances, such as exemptions for the poorest people in society, those who are least able to pay.